Yeah, so I'd say probably about 80 hours of work that I put into this episode is just me going up to NPCs that are out of reach and seeing no dialogue options whatsoever.
The more time I spend talking to you,
What?
the less I'm spending watching for raiders. How the hell did you get up here anyway?
Yeah, alright. I see you, Todd. Hey, thank you very much for exploring outside of Vault 101 with me so we can celebrate episode 101 of a show called BoundaryBreak, where the whole premise is to try to find secrets and discoveries outside the boundaries of any game. And sometimes that can be developer techniques, or in rare cases, left behind content. I want to throw a quick little shout out to Super Stario, who did not make the camera for this game. It's actually publicly available, but he did help me out immensely throughout the entire process. So hats off to you, sir. And with that said, let's get started. So bless you to all the fans who have already seen this, and for whatever reason, they just want to hear it come out of my mouth. And of course, the number one thing from Fallout 3 that everybody seems to know about is the fact that the subway system in the Broken Steel DLC is in fact the player with the train on its head. Now, you'll find plenty of pictures showing you this, but you don't see it very often in-game, and the reason why you don't see it in-game is because when it's happening, the game forces you into a first-person perspective, which is pretty lousy, but in order for this to happen, your character has to be equipped with an accessory that shows the subway train on the character. So with that logic, that means that there has to be an item value for the subway train, and if we inject that into the player's inventory, we can then equip it outside of the scripted scene and show you what it looks like in third person. And I don't know if there's any Silent Hill 2 fans watching right now, but this kind of gives me Pyramid Head vibes. So about the beginning of the game, there's a lot of stuff that's restricted to you. And of course, when you're first born, you're the most restricted because you can't walk and you can't really even have great eyesight, to be honest with you. And as a result of that, there are questions to be asked. One of which being, of course, what does your mother look like? You always get to see your dad, and you do meet up with Dr. Lee later on in the game. However, your mother is off to the side and you never get to see her face. Well, the game doesn't make that easy because there are visual effects and the lighting is really dark. However, by enabling full bright to the game, we can get a really good look at what your mother is supposed to look like. And you know what? Well, there you go. I don't know why they kept this a mystery from you, but nevertheless, very happy to reveal the answer to that question. Look, at this point, I don't think it's an episode of Boundary Break unless we do appreciate the little things. So many people are so fixated on the key events that they pass over some of the more interesting stuff. Like over here with this sign marquee, it displays multiple messages. But if you were to take the camera outside the boundaries, you'd see that the marquee messages are all attached to a cylinder object, and that object simply turns to display the next message. And out of respect for you, the viewer, I like to lump things into categories so not to pad out the episode. And with that said, the goat example is very similar, except instead of being attached to a cylinder object, it's just one really long texture that starts from the top and just continues to rise through the geometry of the game. And as you can see here from outside the boundaries, it's really interesting to see it all at once. Yeah, this one's a pretty good one. So, all the Pip-Boys on every single character model that has one in the game has something a little bit special going on underneath the hood. If you clip through the geometry of any Pip-Boy that's turned off, you can see a second screen underneath that shows you a low textured image of the stats. Now, I wasn't able to capture any footage of a NPC using the Pip-Boy for this episode, but the way that this would operate is that when the NPC is using the Pip-Boy, the texture that represents the screen being turned off would just get removed. Alright, let's take the camera outside some of the environments and see what they look like. Here at the end of leaving the vault, you can see shimmers of the outside world through the door. Now, of course, the outside can't actually be there. It has to load. So then what is it that's being represented as the outside? Well, it turns out it's a really small dome texture that uses the image of the sky. And this isn't totally consistent across all areas. Like the gate that leads to the DLC, the pit, it has a little bit more going on. There's a lot of 3D geometry being used here. And it looks like it's designed for the player to go through a tunnel. And as for the scene where Liberty Prime goes through a hangar, well, I'm sure a lot of you want to know what's going on with that. After all, even if you were to peek at what's going on up above, you're blinded by white light. But as you can see here, I have absolutely no problems looking the camera by and seeing what else the game is hiding. You can see that little sky dome is used once again, and since Liberty Prime is so big, he in fact clips through the sky dome, which I guess makes our Iron John here a boundary breaker as well. Now, I know that this next segment is not really traditional boundary break, though the whole concept of boundary break is to challenge the player's perception of what a game is supposed to look like, and of course reveal things that the player is never meant to see. In this case, you're in a simulation called Tranquility Lane, and while you're in this simulation, you only get to see the world in black and white, or sepia tone. However, all the objects in this portion of the game are not in fact sepia tone colored. It's a filter used by the game's engine, and so if we remove that filter, you find out that there is one area inside of Fallout 3 that is pretty colorful. Most of everything that you see here is not used outside of this simulation, so seeing the true colors of everything is something that the player should never get to see. And for whatever reason you are not satisfied with the idea of this being a boundary break segment, I'll give you a zoom out of Tranquility Lane with its color restored. While we're on the subject of Tranquility Lane, let's follow up on some viewer requests. Some folks want to know what happens when you try to talk to certain characters inside the pods, if you were to be able to get inside of them. And when you try to talk to your dad, you get a blank message, indicating that you did properly try to talk to him, but unfortunately there's just no dialogue attached to him at the time. And then there's the Overseer Braun. Now, in this case, you're not supposed to be able to open up his pod, you're not ever able to even talk to him. And if you get inside of the pod, it says he's unconscious. That adds a whole new layer of problems. I want to know if he has any dialogue, so we gotta wake him up. And with console commands, we can make that happen. And this is what happens if you wake him up and try to talk to him.
Yeah? Later.
That's right, you get a generic NPC voice.
Hey there. Later.
First of all, I want to show you what it looks like when you look inside of Megaton before you load the city. One Bethesda developer trope is to have a settlement completely walled in so that you have no choice but to go through the loading zone. And part of the fun here is that you get to see all the environments of that area in low poly if you don't go through that load zone. So while a lot of this looks like a jumbled mess, you can see right here, this is a low poly version of the atom bomb that we're going to be blowing up. And the reason why we're going to be blowing it up is because some people wanted to know what the explosion looked like up close. This was a viewer request, of course, and as always, if you ever want to let me know what you want to see in an episode that I'm covering, you just got to follow me right there on the Twitter, and it's very likely I'll get you covered. And looking at this explosion up close is kind of interesting, because a lot of the effects aren't just a simple 2D texture like I thought it would be. No, instead, the textures actually do bend into a three-dimensional shape. It's just that it's still faced towards the player, so that this 3D effect is only being used in the direction in which the player is going to see it, which, by the way, is pretty common for stuff that would be backdrop scenery in games. Alright, so check this out. Outside the walls of the Jefferson Memorial, you're gonna find something really strange. It's the initials M and Q. Now, if you're not one of those types of people that tool around in the Fallout 3 map editor, this might be a little bit confusing to you. But the initials stand for the words main quest. And although you can't see them, there are markers right underneath these initials that are supposed to trigger events for the main quest. And in this case, there are 6 markers that are supposed to spawn Enclave soldiers. And if we were to look at that same area in a map editor, you can see the 6 markers that are supposed to be underneath.
Face to face at last.
Now we're taking a look at President Eden, who is a self-appointed president of the Capital Wasteland. And there's 2 really cool things to check out over here. One is a floating object that is just behind the screen that talks to you, that appears to use a terminal texture to wrap around the object. And what this object serves to do is be a node for President Eden's head, which I totally understand sounds so unusual, but the reason why it has to be here is so that when your character speaks to President Eden, the camera knows which direction to point at. And since President Eden isn't a traditional person in the world of Fallout, something had to be put in place to recreate the same behavior. All the way down below President Eden, though, in the same room, is a terminal model that controls whether or not the Enclave radio appears on the Pip-Boy, which is pretty crazy that it's stored down here. I think any person who plays a Bethesda game gets very frustrated when you hit an invisible wall. The overworld's way of saying you can't go any further than this, and yet you look ahead and you can see further than that. You can see plenty of stuff. Well, for the most part, the map does end in Fallout 3. You can get to a point where there's just no more environment left. However, for whatever reason, in the lower left-hand corner of the map, the environment continues on, and it goes on for a very long time. The only trouble is I can't show the entire thing in one giant shot because the environment only seems to load depending on where the player's position is. So then what happens is when I zoom out the camera, you just see the square that was loaded around the player coordinates. Even if I didn't zoom out the map, if you just look back to where the overworld map is supposed to be, you can still see where the world's end is, except for the fact that as you keep marching away from it, you get more and more unique environment. I have been told, however, that this environment was supposed to be used for testing purposes. Let's move on to the Mothership Zeta DLC. There was a lot of requests for this DLC in particular, though one of the things that nobody was really asking about that I thought was actually really cool to show off was, where does Sally go when she goes inside the vents? Well, there's this great area of the game that is perfect to show this off, because we can answer all of that in one shot. See, on the right here is where Sally's going through the vent, and you can see where the character model stops its animation and it freezes for a little while before it looks like it disappears. Well, Sally here did not disappear. In fact, if you look over to the left, you can see that she was teleported to a very specific coordinate in a different portion of the map. In fact, if you slow down the footage, you can see the exact frame in which she warps into the room. And now it's time to show off what everyone was asking for, which is the wonderful world of skyboxes in Mothership Zeta. I'm going to ignore all the things that seem totally wrong with that last sentence to just bring you to the point that Mothership Zeta uses a lot of space textures to sell you on that illusion of where you are. Some of these have to be really massive in order to hold these enormous exterior spaceship scenes. Now, if the lighting looks a little foreign to you, it's because the spaceship is supposed to have really dark lighting, and for the sake of showing you every detail that this spaceship has to offer, I've disabled all lighting effects. Level of detail is one of the funnest things to talk about on this show, and with open world games, they always hide weird things underneath the map. In Breath of the Wild, you find that there's a water layer that's just stretched and pulled in the entire game's world. Here in Fallout though, you'll find that the low poly version of all the environments is resting right underneath the more detailed environments that you're currently in. As you get further and further away from any given environment, eventually you should be able to see this environment off in the distance, though it's much harder to tell from the distance that you're standing at versus looking at it up close like this. Also, I haven't done this in a while. Let's take a look at some birds. And I was convinced that for the first time on this show, we would have a completely flat texture representing the bird, but that's not the case. Apparently it uses a very low texture to represent the bird, but the texture is still bent into a 3D image. Granted, that 3D image is basically a paper airplane, but it still managed to make the cut. And of course, here is a zoom out of the entire wasteland. Unfortunately, with how the engine works for Fallout 3, you do lose a lot of detail as you zoom further and further out, but still, granted, with how much distance you have to travel throughout the world of Fallout 3, it's still really impressive to see it all in one giant square. And now I'm going to pass it over to the Fallout New Vegas episode, which was the very first episode that Snipey ever narrated for BoundaryBreak. He was a host that we had to let go, sadly, but that's why there's going to be a different voice here than you hear for the other episode that's going to be after this one. I think he did a great job, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
So we're just going to jump into this right at the end of the game with one of my favorite discoveries of this whole thing. As hopefully most of you know, there's this ending slideshow that presents you the ending that you got, and for most players, that's where the story ends. That's the last thing you see. For those of you more initiated, you may have known that you're actually able to move around in this final room, I believe under special circumstances, but I've seen it done before just in general. The thing about this room is that if you take a closer look at some of the edges, you can see that it's very hastily put together. Obviously, you're not meant to be able to walk around this place, and so the room that they've created is very bare bones and not well structured. But what many of you may not have known, and I didn't discover until filming this episode, if we go behind this wall, there's an NPC reciting the endgame slideshow audio. But the interesting stuff doesn't stop there, because if you go to rob the guy, you can see that his name is Ron the Narrator, which I believe is a nod to Ron Perlman. He does a lot of voiceover for the Fallout games, and it's really weird to see him in this room. But to me, this seems like some developers having fun, or maybe a slight wink at the camera, if you will. So now that we've seen what the developers hide outside the bounds at the end of the game, let's go back to the beginning and see what we can find there. And Doc Mitchell's house is actually a great area to explore to check out some of the developer tricks that they use across the entire game. Starting off small, there's these holes in the wall, sort of all over the place. The way that they actually work is they're comprised of multiple layers of geometry. You have the wall in the front, you have the sort of wooden beam in between, and then you have this back wood layer with wiring sort of across it. It's actually this really large square, like way larger than it needs to be. And that's because one of the things that the developers use so often in these kinds of games are pre-made assets that make environment building a lot easier. So one of the things in Fallout New Vegas is that if you're ever in a building, there is no exterior. There is nothing outside. It is just void. So the way that they sort of give off the illusion that there is stuff outside, in most cases, is actually really weird. So what they have in this instance in Doc Mitchell's house is they have this large texture of a color, and then to give the illusion that it's this light that's super bright outside that you can't really make out any details, they have some rays of light coming through the window as well. But the main thing with that is if we go to this window in particular, you can see that they didn't quite line the effect up properly. Looks kind of goofy. Now, because the player is not ever meant to go into the void, the developers often will hide stuff or leave stuff out in this empty space, whether that's because they forget or they're kind of essential pieces of how the game functions. But in this case, if you've ever been curious as to what's beyond the blue door, I believe you'll be disappointed because it's just this really large plank. And not to rain on anybody's parade here, but the plank seems to be quite useless. You can't see it from inside. There's no interaction with it. I think the only reason that it would still be here is if the developers used it as reference, as the origin of this map, or they forgot about it. I mean, it's a plank. But one thing that they didn't forget about is this note that's sort of just above this hallway. And if we interact with it, you can actually see that it is the hardcore mode prompt pop-up. So when you go to talk to Doc Mitchell as you leave, this will pop up asking you if you want to enable hardcore mode. And if you're me, you press no. But the main thing is that this prompt has to come from somewhere. And so they've stored it in this note that's just outside the bounds. And one of its quirks is that you can't actually interact with it once you've accepted that dialog box. So once you've selected one of these options, it lies dormant, waiting for the next new game. By the way, Doc Mitchell's note is not the only interactable object that is hidden above the ceiling. If we take a look at this building in Prim, for example, you can see that there's an elevator button just floating there. And while it would have been cool enough to just sort of stop there, if we go to push the button, we can try to fix the elevator. The only problem is when you try to fix the elevator, nothing happens. And you can't use whatever elevator that this button is trying to reference. Though it's possible that this is a leftover of the elevator that's in the floor above. If you're familiar with the other Fallout games or Skyrim, you'll know that the developers often hide stashes underneath maps where characters have maybe like a store or some sort of personal inventory that they need restocked at any given point. And for Fallout New Vegas, that's no different. And in this instance, there's this card game called Caravan that you can play, and because the bets have to come from somewhere because they're actual caps that go to and fro, they're actually stored outside the bounds in these 3 small chests. And speaking of chests, in the Novak gas station, we have a problem. And that problem is, I don't know what these are for. Under basically every apartment building, there's these footlockers that are underneath the buildings. And every time I check them, they're always empty. But strangely enough, that's not the only thing wrong with the Novak gas station, because in this apartment right by the stairs, if you go in and then take the camera back out the door you just came in, you'll see that there's actually a duplicate door. If we interact with this door, it teleports us into the middle of the desert, really far away from Novak. From what I know, this isn't used in any quest. There's no reason for this door to really bring you here, and so I believe this is actually cut content. There's actually a lot of unused content in Fallout New Vegas, none of which is readily accessible to the player. In that same building with the elevator button, if we take a look at the upper floor, there's actually an entire hallway section that's removed, full of different rooms and doors that don't really lead anywhere. Once again, this is possible because the developers reuse assets, and this could possibly be some sort of interior prefab that they decided to shorten the length of in this building. And if we take a look inside Vault 21, we can see a similar story. There's this door in the hallway that you can't normally go through, but if we take a camera inside, outside, there's actually this really long stretch of interior that has full collision and modeling. Though at the point where the hallways diverge, they do go into nowhere. Throughout the game, interiors tend to be a really great source of out-of-bounds material. In this room, for instance, if we take the camera below the floor, you can see that there is a light attached to the bottom of the floor, you know, in the wrong spot. And this, to me, seems like maybe a leftover asset where they originally intended for the lights to be turned inside that room, maybe just that square of that room in particular. But along the way, they decided that they wanted the light turned the other way, and so we have a remnant of the light turned the wrong way in the floor. And developers don't just hide stuff inside either. Now, if we take a close look at my position on the map here, and then go through the floor like a normal person, you'll see that there's an unused rock asset in this area. Now, try as I might, I couldn't find the exact use of this rock elsewhere in the game, though I'm sure if you look hard enough, there is an instance of it, but it's just really fun to see when developers leave geometry below where you can really even see it. And honestly, that opens me up to talk about some of my favorite weirdness that I found, and that's if in any outside area you take the camera below the floor you're standing on, you'll see that there's the high level of detail mesh on top, and always below there's the low level of detail mesh rendered alongside you the entire way. I don't know how many resources this is particularly taking up, but it's one of those elements of Fallout jank that I feel really sell the experience. One of the things that I love about New Vegas is that off in the distance there's always some sort of landmark that you can see. One of the first ones in general being this NCR statue. And if we take our camera super far away from the player, we can see how this is pulled off with low poly meshes. And because the player is never meant to see it from this distance, they don't have to put that much effort into making it anything other than kind of the silhouette. But one interesting thing, they kept the poles. Honestly, a little shocked to see them there. And you know what? It's that time of the episode. We get to talk about low poly birds. And this bird model is actually really close to the one that they use in Fallout 3. Almost exactly the same, actually. It's kind of this weird paper plane shape. By the way, to compare the two, here's a look at the high poly bird. Notice the extra detail and the lack of paper plane. And let's take this opportunity to look a little bit closer at some of the character and creature models that we'll see throughout the rest of the game. First, let's take a look at the player character. You, or in this case, me. If we take the camera in for a closer look, we can see a lot of the details in the skin, around the neck and the hands. And these textures actually have a lot of detail to them. One of the techniques at play here is they have a close-up image of real human skin detail that they've overlaid on top of this model. And in the case of the hands, it can lead to an appearance of high detail. Though admittedly, the hands do look kinda dated and gross. But it looks like the top half of the body got all of the love, because these legs are something else. And do not get me started on the texture that they've overlaid on this foot block. And along that line, there's actually a quirk with how Fallout New Vegas reuses Fallout 3 assets. Like with the Super Mutant model, where in order for them to wear these sort of flip-flops, they actually have a foot rendered outside their normal foot. Taking the camera inside reveals that it's sort of similar to the player character's foot, where it's this really blocky shape. Next up, we have a fairly standard looking wolf, but actually there's a lot to see here. And on this model in particular, there seems to be a lot of issues with transparency at the seams, and we can see that replicated in a couple places on the model, namely the chest and one of the back legs. But real quick, let's take a look at the eyes. Moving the camera in on the right eye, you can see that it's fairly standard, though it is interesting to note that the eye is almost fully rendered. But if we take a closer look at the left eye, you can see something a little strange. And that's because there's two eyes occupying this single socket, with one being really big and one being really small. And they actually overlay each other on the outside of the model too. One of the earlier enemies you encounter in Fallout New Vegas are these giant mantises. And one detail that I want to take a closer look at, because you kind of don't really see it ever, they have this really cool idle animation where they strike a pose. And you can see in this animation, and a lot of their other animations, is that they have wings. And if we take a closer look in their abdomen here, which yes, is pulsating at all times, you can see that the wings are always fully rendered. Anyway, here's some detail shots of the Cazador. You can see that there's a lot of cool effects done on the textures to give them sort of this glossy, insect-like appearance. And it's really gross! And since guns are such a big part of the Fallout experience, considering most of the time you have one in your hands, I want to take this time to look at some of the interesting things with how they modeled the weapons. And every weapon is modeled slightly differently. If we take a look at the varmint rifle, which you get right at the start of the game, one interesting thing to note is while on the outside it looks quite normal, if we take a look at the magazine, you can see that there is a bullet fully modeled. Though what's interesting about it is that instead of having a separate bullet texture, it actually has what appears to be the texture map of the gun itself. On the casing, you can see some of the metal parts of the gun, but taking a look at the bullet itself reveals that it has the wooden texture from the stock. And I have a question for you. Can you see the bullet in this hunting rifle? No? Here, I'll give you a hint. It's right here. Yes, instead of having the same technology used for the varmint rifle, it's a flat texture on top of the magazine. And what's weirder still is that even though these two guns use different forms of bullets for their magazines, a lot of the weapons in the game don't even render the bullets in general. But there's one gun where you can see all the bullets, and an extra one. On this 357 revolver, taking a look inside the cylinder, you can see that there's the 6 bullets that the gun normally fires around in a circle, and then in the center we have this extra bullet, but this one fully modeled. And we actually know why this bullet exists. When you're reloading the 357, every new bullet you put in is this middle bullet, which teleports in and out of the gun. Now, if you've played New Vegas at all, you're probably familiar with the questline where some ghouls want to go to space. And there's a whole lot of weird stuff about this place. In the dome where the rockets are later launched from, if we take the camera inside even before we've done any part of the quest, you can see that the rockets are always loaded beneath the floor. And if we go inside the facility, there's some other things that we can see too. Like one of these doors, for example, which are made up of these parallel squares that occupy the same space. But when they come up from the ground, they're separated from their height, which combines to create the door. And if you've ever wanted to do a little boundary breaking yourself without having to use a camera, in this room that overlooks the rockets, if you get close enough to the window and crouch, you can see that the developers didn't render this wall high enough for you to not be able to see out of the map. Taking the camera inside the chamber and then looking back towards the window reveals that the wall also isn't fully displayed. And if you were ever wondering if the ghouls made it to their destination, I have some bad news for you. If we take the camera outside of this viewport that the player would normally see this from, the rockets don't actually make it that far before they're teleported back to their original position underneath the dome. Taking the camera back through this door in the viewport reveals another secret. And if you see this computer monitor, you may be thinking, well, what's that for? And funnily enough, if we go to interact with it, you can see that it's an NPC that you can talk to, and it gives you default dialogue.
What do you need?
But what's interesting to note is that this monitor is named Launch Music. This is where the music actually plays from when the launch sequence is initiated. And we can see this trick used elsewhere if we go into the New Vegas Strip. Under the Lucky 38, we can see another computer, but this one is named Tops Radio. Before we fully head into the New Vegas Strip, though, I want to take a look at these gardening tents just outside. And what's weird about these is not so obvious at first, since for the player, once you go inside, there's not a whole lot to do. You can walk around on the interior, and then you can leave out the door you came in, or the door on the other side, and that puts you out on the other side of the tent. But taking full advantage of our ability to leave the bounds, and moving the camera out of these tents, you can see that they're actually all interwoven and connected in a really strange way. And yes, the doors are fully functional. And it's weird enough in general that all these areas are interconnected. What's stranger still is that the environment around these tents actually extends for quite a while. And by quite a while, I mean I auto-walked for over 40 minutes and I didn't find the edge. I sped up my speed to 10,000%, kept walking, and eventually it just reloaded me back in the center of the map. So I don't really know how far it goes, but no matter which direction you go, there's always this single chunk of floor that is constantly underneath you. Kinda crazy. And because I think it's a little interesting, I just want to take a moment of appreciation for this sign in the middle of nowhere that simply just says duh, which, looking a bit closer, reveals that the text is actually floating off of the sign. The New Vegas Strip is probably the most important area of the game, and it's only fitting that it has some of the weirdest stuff going on. First things first, and this is similar to the tents outside, every area in the Strip is actually fully rendered when you're outside. Though not all of the doors work. Trust me, I've tried. Here's another close look at reused assets, with a lot of these smaller building assets that actually make up this larger area. They're kind of these smaller squared off shapes that are copy-pasted to create the look of larger buildings. As for large buildings, without further ado, we have the largest one in the game, the Lucky 38 Tower, which, if you were wondering, the low level of detail model is rendered on all sides, but the high detail model is actually only rendered in the front where the player can see it. Taking the camera outside of the tower shows that both floors are actually loaded in at the same time. And for some reason at ground level, there's a fully modeled, albeit low poly landscape, even in areas that the player can't see. And in case you saw that door, worry not, because we can lockpick it, though we can't open it or do anything with it, and it doesn't go anywhere. And while we're on the topic of the Lucky 38, this is actually a great opportunity to look at one of the viewer requests, which was to take a closer look at what the lab looks like. And looking around, you can see that there's a lot of nonsense geometry. And considering that this room is almost completely pitch black, a lot of this stuff is actually unseeable by the player. And to the one guy who was wondering where the boomers fire their rockets from, turns out the rockets come from thin air, right behind that control tower. And here's a closer look at that artillery shell that the boomers fire. The colors on this shell are interesting too. There's the red hot tip and the green color on the side. The other side is mostly a black color. It's interesting that this is textured at all because the player can barely ever see this, but it might be reusing another projectile from a different weapon. And in one of the quest lines for the boomers, there's this plane that's crashed in the bottom of a lake, and you attach some buoys to the bottom of the wings to get it to float. But what you may not have noticed is that where the plane is crashed and where it comes out of the water are actually two completely different spots. Now, it makes sense that the plane comes up where it does, because that's where the player has to stand, but in that case, why not just put the plane there to begin with? Seems like a bit of a strange choice. And for those of you who wanted to know what's underneath the dam, I have a treat for you. On this side of the dam, going underneath reveals a vertibird, the very same vertibird that's used at the end of the game during the dam fight, if you've completed the Enclave quest and asked them to help you, which I did. And that Enclave quest actually leads to one of my favorite things that I found, and this was totally on accident. In every area of the game that I found, except for this one, the void has been this sort of tan color. And taking the camera out of this vault, and specifically this room is where I found it, you'll see that not only is this void a light blue, this room, for some reason, is encased in a black cube. And so far, the only time I've ever seen a black cube used in this game is to give the illusion of interiors on buildings with broken windows. So I don't know why this is here, but it's really cool. And it's just like a cherry on top. The rest of this area is loaded in too, with the doors just teleporting you between the rooms. And also the entire thing is full of black rectangles. And to tie this video off, here is a zoom out of the entire map.
And now we're going to move on to Fallout 4. A lot of great discoveries made here on this show. Hope you enjoy it. Yes, I've heard the comments about how I got the colors wrong on a certain texture in this episode. Please forgive that. Compare a zoom out of the Boston Common in real life versus how it is in Fallout 4, with the Capitol building as a reference point. And as it becomes very apparent as you zoom out, the Boston Common in Fallout 4 is way smaller than it is in real life, which is to be expected. Nothing in Fallout is one-to-one. But as you're going to see in this transition here, the scale of Boston in Fallout 4 is so much smaller than the Boston in real life that just the parks alone in the real Boston actually reach past the outskirts of Boston in Fallout 4. Next up is the starting area of Fallout 4, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you actually came here for this. For some reason, as beautiful as this area is, it's very short-lived and very restricted. But outside of the Wanderer's house, there's a lot of stuff to see. All the homes and cars are pre-war, so everything looks really nice, and they even have interiors to all the vehicles. Like, for example, this one over here seems to use a television screen. Okay. I mean, this one over here seems a lot more conventional. I'm just kind of curious. But moving on, just how far does this area actually go? And well, let me show you. Well, it might not look like much because outside of all the beautiful trees is a barren wasteland. The developers did overcompensate on how many trees they really need to put into this area. Because outside of the cliff that the vault is actually placed on, you don't really get a great look at the depth of any of these areas without dying immediately from the bomb blast. Though it should be noted, since you can see quite a decent view from this cliffside, a lot of Boston's biggest buildings are off in the distance. And if we rush over there real quick, we can see that it's all pre-war, despite the fact that the player should never be able to see the detail of these things, given the distance and the fog. Also, oddly enough, the vault door seems to have a black dome on top of it with backface culling. People who've watched my videos in the past will probably recognize this effect whenever I looked at a skybox in a normal game. But outside of that, there's really not much to look at, so we'll do a zoom out and move on. So next up is a viewer request, and as always, you can follow me on Twitter if you ever feel like you have a wish list for a certain game as what you want to see. But anyways, they want to know what happens with Kellogg and the scientist after they take the baby. And only to dispel some curiosity here, because I do admit it's not that exciting. Once Kellogg and the scientist are off screen, they just kind of stand in place without anything really out of the ordinary going on. In fact, they're not even frozen in place, which is something that you would typically see if you were to look at the ending animation for a scripted scene that you weren't allowed to see. Next up is the Deathclaw when you first help out the Minutemen. This iconic enemy comes out of the ground this time around, specifically a metal plate. Now I just wanted to see if the Deathclaw was there waiting the entire time. It turns out he manifests into the game the moment that he starts banging his way through. But what's actually really cool here is that the second that he is summoned into the game, there's an animation that the player would never be able to see before he pokes his head out into the street. Next up is Diamond City, and as anyone who's played this game knows, if you go into Diamond City, it has to load up the city, and if you leave the city, it has to load up the entire world. So the question we want to answer here is, what does Diamond City look like before you enter it? And when you're in Diamond City, what does it look like when you get out? Well, when you look at it from the outside looking in, you can see that it's all very low poly stuff. There's absolutely no details to the buildings whatsoever, outside of looking like a bunch of rusty boxes. Now as for what's outside the stadium when you're actually in there, I'm actually a little bit surprised by this. Apparently, the city of Boston goes into low poly mode, but it's essentially all there. The stadium itself is stacked so high that you really wouldn't be able to see pretty much any of this. But I suppose the biggest reason for all this is so that the city can actually look very populated when you're outside all of the buildings. Because outside of that, the game handles itself very well as far as loading in details and buildings. And you know what? There's actually one thing I want to explain on my show right now. It's just one of those things where you think that everybody's in the know about it, but you end up surprised by how many people have no idea. In a lot of games, in especially open world games, there is a thing called level of detail. And in Fallout 4, there's different stages of details depending on how far away you are from buildings or objects. And I thought it'd be fun, even if you know what LOD is, to show you at least one building in Boston in all of its various stages of detail. And if you were unaware about all this, developers have been getting away with this for years by hiding these low poly details behind other effects like fog and blur depending on how far away you are from the object. Another viewer request was for Swan. Folks want to know what he's doing underneath that water before you actually activate the fight. And I gotta admit, I was hoping for something a little more ridiculous. I was expecting him to at least have his limbs caved in on each other, but that's not the case. But I did end up finding something kind of interesting here. You see, inside of Swan's body is a branch, like many others that you can see on his body. And for whatever reason, this one branch is completely untextured, which is why it has that bright pink look. Now, one of the most interesting things about Fallout 4 that comes from one of the most least interesting things in video games in general is the way it handles doors. Yeah, doors of all things. Let me run you down how this all works. So if you open a door in Fallout 4 and it doesn't have an opening animation whatsoever, it means that there's likely just a flat wall directly behind the door. However, any door that opens in Fallout 4, even just a crack, likely has something behind it. Whether it be triangular geometry or perhaps a low poly version of the entire outdoors. It's just that what's fundamentally odd about all this is that there's no consistency to it. One might want to ask themselves why they even bother to make some doors open a crack at all, or if you want to go through that extra effort, sure, but why don't you just have basic geometry behind every door? I don't know, but either way, it was a ton of fun for me. But if you're a fan of basic geometry, and who isn't, I'm sure there's a long way to get inside of that exclusive club. All of you have no further to look than the very edge of the map in Fallout 4. Now, normally the game stops you whenever you try to walk outside the boundaries of the game. It's very clear that at certain points you're just not allowed to go any further. But if you were allowed to go any further, this is what you would see. The world ends in a 90-degree angle, much like how the map does when you reference it. And in the bottom left-hand corner of the map, you can see that the land ends a few feet away from the ocean. And then the ocean meets at the corner, and you can also see the ocean floor and see how far that goes before that ends as well. A quick little update to this segment: if you take the character model past the edge of the map, the game will actually leave a square of water underneath the player at all times. Very thoughtful. I was kind of at odds with myself on whether or not to save this for the sequence break episode, and you'll totally see why in a second. So what we're going to be looking at here is the Pridwin, the flying airship of the Brotherhood of Steel. And after you defeat Kellogg, you'll see the ship flying across the sky, which gives you now an opportunity to fast travel or regular travel over to where the Pridwin docks. But if you were fast enough to move manually through the sky and get to the docking station before the Pridwin does, something really interesting starts to happen. One thing you've probably already noticed is that all the objects that are supposed to be on the stationary version of the Pridwin are already there, hanging in the sky. But even more interesting than that is that when the prop Pridwin starts to come into the docking station, the stationary version of the Pridwin actually loads in before the prop one can finish moving into place. So for a very short period of time, there's actually two Pridwins here. Virgil from the Glowing Sea also has something interesting to hide. If we take the camera inside of Virgil's head, he has an extra set of teeth. Now, these teeth don't serve any purpose at all. I thought maybe once he starts talking, the two sets of teeth swap out or something, but no, this set of teeth that's in the back of his head doesn't move or do anything. So a lot of people were asking what happens to the MIT building after it explodes. And from that suggestion, I actually have two things to show you. The first one I want to show you is what actually happens, like you asked. It basically just immediately swaps out the vanilla version of MIT versus the post-nuked MIT area. Plus, that enormous explosion that you see before the Brotherhood of Steel ending is actually just a whole bunch of 2D textures. Now, I gotta admit, it's actually pretty convincing looking when you're just standing there on top of the building, but when you angle the camera in certain different ways, you can see very little resources used to pull this effect off. And of course, we gotta do a zoom out of the entire map of Fallout 4, or at least as much as we possibly can before there's pretty much nothing left to see.